Shalom Charim, I'm Stephen Ben. You're watching Israeli News Live. Israel's Channel 7 is reporting about the Israeli military striking the what they call the Iranian uh, special troops inside of Iraq, or Iranian proxies, but it's actually this is the um, Iraqi Popular Forces that were struck by the Israelis there on the border with Syria and Iraq. The United States and both Israel are working to try to thin out or to cause more havoc there in the region. And this situation is going to end up spiraling out of control. I'm very much concerned about that. And I know that we had shared with you in one of our releases earlier today that we had gotten intel coming out right there on the border with Iraq and Syria that the U.S., of course, had a base that they built right there on the border, and that base there is being used to try to keep Iraqi soldiers from assisting President Bashar al-Assad in overthrowing the ISIS and al-Qaeda, al-Nusra fighters that are in this region of the world. And it's kind of interesting. I know that there's been a lot of new pictures coming out painting General Soleimani as even so far as to saying that he was part of the mastermind of taking down the Twin Towers on 9/11. Do you realize how absurd that is? I wonder if anybody really knows that the United States government, the U.S. military, worked with General Soleimani as the head of the Quds forces in order to overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan. Yeah, it's actually General Soleimani that they worked with. Qasem Soleimani was their direct man with the Iranian government that was giving all the actions, all the information to successfully overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan, step by step. And the United States military followed that step by step, and he was a #1 ally for U.S. forces in overthrowing the Taliban in Afghanistan. Of course, we're still bogged down over there, and what really changed all this is when President Bush decided to call Iran the axis of evil and then turned on the very ally that the United States had in fighting in Afghanistan, and instead labeled them as the axis of evil, which the Khomeini at that time, which I know the guy's not a good guy, period, but nonetheless, Khomeini said to his own people, said to even General Soleimani, that we will be next. Of course, he had a little help from General Wesley Clark, letting him know the play plan of the U.S., and that was to overthrow the 7 nations in 5 years, which included Iran, and Iran would be last. But nonetheless, they've known it. And this is why General Soleimani then was put in charge of trying to thwart U.S. Advances inside of Iraq. So yes, he did have American blood on his hands when it comes to that issue there, but then again, we went into Iraq on a completely false pretense altogether. Now that we find out what the technology is, at least we don't know directly, but we know that when it was told to us that the Iranians have a technology, but from the Chinese that we cannot mitigate, we realize what that is. They can actually fire missiles at U.S. forces indiscriminately there, and we cannot track it. We cannot shoot those missiles down. They have shown this, as we shared with you the other day from our older footage there. We shared with you how that they give this technology to the Houthi rebels that were fighting. They were able to take out, hit oil refineries inside of Saudi Arabia and totally could not be detected whatsoever. Now they've proven themselves once again to be able to take out and hit the American bases inside of Iraq totally unimpeded. Now, what kind of reaction can we do? Well, the United States does have at its capabilities a very powerful nuclear arsenal that it could use. They also have the ability to use what we call bunker busters or tactical nukes, and that may be the very card that the United States ends up playing. But the problem is, we hear the president talk about that we have in the works right now these supersonic missiles as well, but we do not really have those missiles as of yet. We can only say that we have it in the works. In the works doesn't mean that they're coming out next week or next month. It might be next year or next couple of years down the road. Problem is, the Chinese and the Russians already have it, and once they begin to lob theirs our way, if we can't stop Iranian missiles because of some type of technology that the Iranians got from the Chinese that we can't mitigate, and that's not supersonic missiles, which, oh, by the way, yes, I did remember, because I actually shared with the Israeli Knesset when I'd gotten the intelligence, I don't know, about 8 months ago, that actually it was the technology was given to Hezbollah, or at least I believe that it was given to Hezbollah in order to be able to use not a hypersonic missile, but close to a hypersonic missile, a missile that could not be stopped by any of the Israeli type defenses there. And if Hezbollah begins to jump into this, Iran, even though that they don't have, we'll say they don't have nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, they have the ability to bypass any defense system Israel has. Guess what then? All this talk of war and destroying Iran and destroying the Middle East is going to end up backfiring. Who's going to pay the price? American soldiers, American lives, Israelis, not just the Israeli soldiers, but more importantly, Israeli civilians. They will pay the price of arrogance in the Middle East. You know, listen, I don't know. Maybe we should say, what is it? It's really Satan's world. Anyway, I want to share with you some things that are going on here. This is CNN, and I'm not fond of CNN, but I just have this here for the report of what the United States is calling Russian aggression. And then, of course, RT comes out with their, as they say, the Americans' video only shows the proof that this aggression was not Russian aggression. It was actually the U.S. ship that broke international law and crossed over in front of the Russian ship. And of course, you're looking at the video, you wouldn't really know that, but that's the way it, and I looked at it, and that's the way it happened. But let's just listen in to see this, because it's what they consider things that escalate tensions between the two nations. But, you know,
CNN, new video of a close and dangerous encounter between a Russian warship and a U.S. destroyer in the Middle East. Poppy, just the latest in a series of deliberate close encounters like this by Russia.
Yeah, let's go to the Pentagon. Barbara Starr is there. Barbara, tell us about the video.
Well, this video now just in from the U.S. Navy in the Middle East. This happened yesterday. A U.S. destroyer, the Farragut, was sailing in the North Arabian Sea when this Russian warship came up behind it. And you need to look at this video. You will see the Russian ship continue to approach, and approach. It came within 60 yards of...
Now, this is what we're being told. It kept approaching, and approaching. And of course, all we get is what they decide to show on CNN. RT takes that same footage, though, and they show the whole thing of what really happens. And of course, they give you the rules of engagement as far as international shipping law. I know a little bit about this myself because my stepfather was a ship captain, and I was taught a lot about this, how this actually works here. But it says here, Russian Ministry of Defense responded by calling the U.S. claim not consistent with reality. It further explained that it was, in fact, USS Farragut that crossed the path of the Russian ship in violation of international maritime regulations and called the American crew's actions unprofessional. The ministry also said the two videos shot by Americans actually proved that the Russian vessel had the right-of-way. One of them shows the Russian ship sailing to the right of the U.S. destroyer without making any dangerous maneuvers. The two ships can be seen gradually coming closer to each other. And goes on to say there, the second video shows the Russian ship sailing closely behind the U.S. Farragut before it turns away to seemingly avoid a potential collision. All right, the International Regulations Preventing Collisions at Sea, a 1972 convention regulating the rules of navigation in the open sea, states that any vessel which has the other on her own starboard side shall keep out of the way and shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid crossing ahead of the other vessel. All right, and that is true. I know this from my own experience and how that was taught there. So let's take a look at what was really going on here, because they got a point. I mean, look, the proof is in the pudding of the video, as they say. Let me go to the first video. That one there is showing already the U.S. ship crossing the path, but you have to actually see. Here we go right here. This shows it that the U.S. ship, its starboard side, is the Russian ship. All right? Now, they actually both will give warnings, but what will happen is the U.S. ship will cross in front of the Russian ship. The Russian ship also warns. He's sailing there, they're both sailing, but then the U.S. ship crosses in front of it. It makes it look like, though, when you watch the CNN footage, though, if you just go by CNN's footage there, as if their ship was sailing a little bit, but which is kind of interesting. It would also show that it was to the starboard side of the U.S. ship there, but then it makes it look like, oh, he just decided to cut across the rear end of the ship and come towards him. But he actually, you have to understand, ships don't just turn around like cars do. You can't just up and make a U-turn. You know, I mean, of course, the Russians could have backed down, just lowered the speed of the ship, let the American ship continue on course there. So, you know, it's really tit for tat is what it comes down to. You know, they both want to show that their strength, their force, that, oh, you know, by the way, I'm not going to give in to you, and Russia says we're not going to give in to you, and America says we're not going to give in to you. So they both got to show that, oh, we're big, bad, and we can do what we want to do. That's really what it comes down to. But in the actual maritime rules on the sea there, the USS ship, unfortunately, was in the wrong there. I hate to say it, but it is the truth. The Times of Israel. Top Iranian general strikes on U.S. bases were just the start of a big operation. This is not good to hear this here. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Aerospace Force says Iran chose not to kill U.S. soldiers to avenge Soleimani, claimed dozens of injured American troops were evacuated via Israel and Jordan. And this is something that the Iranians have claimed. I was aware of this from the very beginning. My own Middle East source says he does not believe that it was true, that there were U.S. Casualties as far as deaths. He said there may have been some that were wounded, but they claim that there were, I think, 80 that were killed, and there were some over 200, I think, that were injured, is what the Iranians are saying that happened. But they did say they could have killed as many between 4,000 to 5,000 American troops there in the region. That was according to Iran's Fars news agency that had stated that. And the Times of Israel is actually reporting this. So the question is, did that actually happen? Were there any U.S. Deaths in this? I don't know. The Iranians could also, even though they chose not to try to target life in this area, they could have said that, you know, there were American lives lost only to try to save face back home. But nonetheless, the true fact of the matter remains is that their technology allowed those missiles to land on U.S. bases there in the Middle East, and we didn't shoot down any of them. So I don't care what excuse the American politicians want to give us, we're putting our soldiers at risk in a way that needs to come to an end. Also, there was a report that came out on, this is on the Daily Mail, U.S. tried and failed to kill another top Iranian military official in Yemen on the same night the missile strike killed Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, officials say. They were unsuccessful at killing Abdul Reza Shahlai, and which only kind of seems to embolden the fact that only seems to kind of embolden this attempt on this other general over in Yemen seems to suggest that this whole negotiation for peace and to end hostilities in Yemen may have really been a true deal, as we had already reported a couple of months back, because it seems like that they were targeting those figures that would have been responsible for trying to bring about a peace with the Saudis and end the hostilities. And why would they want it to end? Or why would the U.S. not want it to end? Well, because you got to remember, there's a lot of special interest groups, politicians, former generals in America, that if we stop these wars, we stop these bombs from falling, they don't make any money. That's what they call making America great again, right? Make more bombs, more weapons, use those weapons so we can make more bombs, more weapons, so we can make the economy great. Terrible way to make your economy great, though. But a war economy is what pays the bills, right? U.S. won't heed Iraq's call for troop withdrawal, calls military presence there appropriate. Well, we kind of knew that that was going to come that way. The U.S. is not going to obey another nation's desire. After all, we're an occupying force, and we're going to stay that way. That's what America likes to do. House approves measures limiting Trump's authority to take further military action against Iran. Well, that was kind of a joke for the House to do that because no president has ever paid attention to what the House has to say when it comes to doing wars in other nations or taking out any type of military leaders in and around the world. They're going to do it anyway without Congress's approval, and that doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat. They've all shown they could really care less what Congress says or even what the Senate says, for that matter. Anyway, also, we don't need to really talk about this. We already talked a little bit about the fast missiles, things like that. One U.S. service member, 2 DoD contractors killed in a terror attack in a U.S. base in Kenya. I know this is a few days ago, but I just want to make sure you guys are aware. I'm sure you're already aware of that. We did have a strike on our bases inside of Kenya. And last but not least there, we had a volcano that erupted, explosion of ash, smoke into the sky in Mexico. Kind of watch this as it happens here. And there she goes. Up in smoke. Smoke twirls around, kind of like a tornado. I think it's kind of interesting how it does that. That was a volcano in Mexico that's going off. Kind of makes you wonder if we're not going to have some big earthquakes along that belt of fire there, ring of fire as they call it there. It may be very well the very next thing we see. Anyway, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live. I am preparing the messages on the book of Ezekiel. I have not forgotten about you guys on that. Just been trying to keep up with the things that are going on the news here. So we will get back to the book of Ezekiel very soon. I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live. Erev Tov, in a world of Ein Shalom, there is no peace. Good evening.